This is WWE superstar Drew McIntyre, and you're listening to the WWE Podcast.
The champ is
the one that everybody wants, me.
It's going to WrestleMania. Claymore!
Austin 316 says I just whipped your ass. This is my iron. You're going to acknowledge me.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Wrestle Magic. Tonight, the Gardener, Michael Gross, and I, Maintenance Maverick, will just be having some midnight ramblings, just talking about 90s wrestling and just how it was the best and sometimes the worst in some ways. So, without further ado, Michael, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing fantastic. We're having a great day here in Louisville. Our weather is fantastic today. I had an early day. I've been working a lot because I'm going to see my love, Jennifer, hopefully your future aunt. And I'm just really excited to go see her in Phoenix in a few days. But I really wanted to get some content created and some stuff to talk about. And so, Mav, I got to ask you, what year were you born?
1998, my friend.
1998. So I was driving across the country, folks. And everybody knows that Maverick is my nephew. I was driving from Cleveland to San Diego. I lived in San Diego, but I had to come home because my roommate was in the Marine Corps. And so he was deployed overseas for well over a year, so I went back home to Ohio. When he came back, it was time to move everything back. It's a long drive, guys. If you go from Cleveland, Ohio to San Diego, it's 3 days without turning off your engine. So it's a lot more than that when you have to actually use the bathroom, eat some food, and get off the road for some storms. But we would always stop one place. Where was that, Mav?
One place.
Your mother's house. Your mother's house. So, I came in one day. I got to your mother's house with my friend Michael Elwood and Marie and your older sister. She was very little. She was maybe 2. And you were a baby. And so this is the first time I met you. I went into the house, and you had a broken leg as a child. It was really weird. But my sister, your mother, was like, "You want to see your nephew?" I said, "Yeah." And so she took me to her bedroom and opened the door, and you were laying in a crib. You were so small, so teeny. And I just remember looking at you, and I was like, "Oh, that's my nephew." And she told me that your leg somehow had broken as an infant. And folks, this isn't an abuse story. Like, seriously, I don't know what happens. I don't even know if you remember that.
So...
But
legend has it from the stories that I've been told that I was, I guess, trying to learn how to walk. I guess I stomped too hard and just something snapped.
You were so small. You were so small. So, folks, the next day, we all went to sleep. I mean, we were just tired. We'd come through actually tornadic weather, severe thunderstorms, and when we got to my sister's, your mother's, we were just beat up. We were tired. And so myself and my roommate, we all just, everybody crashed. Your dad and I had a couple of beers, and that was it. The next day was breakfast. And so she brought you out and put you in a high chair. And when your mother wouldn't look, I was feeding you jelly from Jelly Donuts, and she didn't want me to do that.
That I didn't know about.
Yes, I kept feeding you jelly. And then she's like, "Why is Maverick licking his lips?" And what was the old story? Oh, I was feeding him from my man teat. So now you know the whole story behind the man teat. And so my sister thought I was trying to nurse you. And so then I would threaten her when she was across the room. She was tired. I mean, she knew, second child. And I would just be like, "Oh, I've got the child. I'm going to feed him from my man teat." And I'm like, "Oh, look, I'm getting him closer." And she would run across the room. And I felt so bad. So that was a long story, a long traveled rib that we'd had for many, many years. So now you know the story behind the whole man teat thing. And, but I just
my
kept
little
giving you
sister,
jelly.
for the longest time, little Gabby used to always call you Man-Teat Guy instead of Uncle Mike or anything.
Well, but I just kept feeding you jelly from the Jelly Donuts because I knew it was eventually going to give your stomach problems and you're going to just flush it out and she'd have to deal with it. So that was my way of ribbing your sister quite a bit. But Let's talk about the 90s a little bit, because you were born in 1999, okay? And so
98,
I was
but yeah.
98. Sorry, I'm the worst uncle in the world, guys. So not as bad as your Uncle Muggs. So when it comes down to what's important in wrestling, 90s changed wrestling. So we're going to give you a brief synopsis of what happened in the 90s and why it spun the whole wrestling world on its ear, because that's what you want to hear. You want to hear about wrestling. You don't want to hear about the man team. So
Hey, you
I
never
wanna
know.
start-
There's some people that might want to talk about it, but we'll leave that for something else.
I really don't want to talk to them. So no. So let's dive into this a little bit. Okay, so the golden era, as everybody called it, which was the 80s, that was the WrestleMania era, when the dawn of WrestleMania came about. But by WrestleMania 4 and 5, the Hogan era had become stale. They tried the belt with Savage. They didn't know what to do, so they turned him heel. Of course, how do you have a 250-pound, 6'1" guy go against a 6'7", 300-pound babyface? It does not matter. They didn't know what to do. And there was many trials, which we're finding out today, that were covered up with a lot of hush money. But I saw a lot of these on, your Geraldo Rivera shows, your Oprah Winfrey's, whatever your talk show du jour was. These shows that were just terrible, and they were talking about allegations of sexual abuse. They were talking about allegations of drug abuse and allegations of steroids.
Right.
Now-
I mean, back then that was kind of the big thing, was all the top stars, they were larger than life, so to speak. So you had pretty much everybody just shooting up with roids. Hogan and all those guys, really, they looked so massive, and I guess the steroids were really just a big thing, right?
Absolutely. Everybody was on him. And if you look at like every superstar wrestler, whether it be NWA or it be WWF at the time before it was WWE, or when it became WCW, the Road Warriors. I mean, all these people have put in their books. Ric Flair's put in his book that he did steroids for many years. Hulk Hogan he came out on the Arsenio Hall show and said he did steroids, then testified against Vince McMahon. Okay, this was a changing of the guard. So the 90s became a mess for wrestling. It became a hot dumpster fire. So they didn't know what to do. Now, the NWA was purchased from Jim Crockett by Ted Turner, who made it, from NWA to WCW, but they still used NWA titles until the NWA seceded. That's a whole other story for our territories. But
Right. I mean, so as the steroid era kind of comes to an end and everything, I've read that Vince McMahon had some trouble finding who was going to be his next star, because, I mean, who are you going to find somebody that's naturally that big? So he turned eventually to Lex Luger, I believe, correct?
Well, he actually turned his eye to two other people first.
Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart?
No. Before them, he was still looking for the bodybuilder. So first he tried Tom McGee. Tom McGee was a gymnast. This guy was chiseled, jacked, racked, stacked. I mean, I wouldn't fight the guy. And he had a tryout match with Bret Hart. Of course, Bret could make anybody look good in the ring. However, when he went in against your Steve Lombardis or your, Barry Horowitz, he looked like the DSs, and anybody who works in the company or in wrestling knows what the DSs are, the drizzling S's. And I figure you guys can put together the dots on that one. So this guy was not it. But then all of a sudden they found this guy who came out of the Dallas territory when Dallas closed. He was the Dingo Warrior. And then said, shave your mustache, and we're going to make you look like Hawk from the Road Warriors. We're going to call you the Ultimate Warrior. And, of course, that wasn't working really well. But they were all part of the steroid era. Now, Tom McGee, not as much, because they said his matches were so bad that they were banned from any wrestler being able to get those tapes when they could ask for any tape in the actual WWE headquarters. Isn't that crazy? I think Chris Jericho actually said he asked every week, I want the Tom McGee versus this guy match. And they were like, no, we won't give that to you.
Jeez. That's insane that they would just withhold that little bit of history. But I guess it makes sense if it's that much of a blemish. I'm sure there's other hidden footage that WWE wouldn't show anybody, like some fatal incidents and whatnot. I could completely understand, like any kind of fatal accidents that could happen. I could understand not wanting to let that out either.
Oh, absolutely. But this wasn't. It was just fatal on your eyes to watch a wrestling match. It wasn't fatal to be actually real trauma. I mean, it was. I have seen some of this footage, and I've had to dive deep. I've had to go on the sister of YouTube is what do you call it? Oh shoot, the one overseas. I can't think of the name of it, but it's basically like YouTube, and it's like I found some of the footage, and it's just garbage. Like the guy couldn't wrestle, like Tom McGee couldn't wrestle, and of course, if you look at like Ultimate Warrior's first matches, he debuted actually as Dingo Warrior. So now all of a sudden, Vince has bought up every territory. And this is more stuff that you and Memphis Mark and I are going to cover as far as where the territories went, except for USWA and Puerto Rico. So, and I think at that point, Dallas was still part of USWA, so they had a little bit of a dying theme going on. And so Daily Motion, by the way, that's the name of the YouTube cousin, Daily Motion. They have a lot of stuff that YouTube gets banned, but it's like overseas. Okay, so getting back to it. The steroid trial happens. Vince McMahon is showing up all the time in a neck brace. Now, did you know the whole thing about the Samoans when they were in the courtroom watching the whole jury for the steroid trial?
I don't know anything about that. The things that I've seen about the steroid trial was a Dark Side of the Ring special mainly. And the lawyers and everybody had talked about, like, yeah, Vince was wearing a neck brace. It was for a legitimate injury, but it just made it seem like he was playing off the old sympathy thing. And it just was kind of funny to see it. Haven't really seen anything about the Samoans in the room, though.
So, yes, this is very interesting. First of all, Vince called Jerry Jarrett, Jeff's dad, to come up and work with Bruce Pritchard because he believed that Jerry would run it the way he wanted it to be run. Because Jerry was this psychologist of creating these characters, but we were tired of characters. We were tired of Christmas creatures and Freddy Kruegers and everything else, but that's what Vince still wanted. But then he realized while he's having this trial that he has to go in a different direction. Now, while he's in this trial, the jury looks at the Samoans, and the legend goes, and even the number one podcaster in Louisville, who I'm slightly behind as number two, Jim Cornette, will tell you, they said, you must acquit this guy, and the Samoans nodded. And they said, you can't find him guilty, and they shook their heads and stared at the jury. Now, who's always been pushed in Vince's territory? Who's always been pushed in WWE? Always the Samoans. So that's a little sidebar. No one, I wasn't there in the room. That's the way the legend goes. I mean, if Cornette says it, I go with him. Bruce Pritchard, I think, has said it. I go with him. I think JR said it. So I'm not going to put those words. I say think. I'm not speaking for them. So getting back on track. All of a sudden, Vince is acquitted. The neck brace mysteriously just fell off. But now he has to figure out a new direction to go in. So you look at your workers now. We got to get away from the big, huge guys. But you had a guy like Yokozuna.
Right.
Okay, who you couldn't believe that Shawn Michaels was going to beat him.
Absolutely
then you brought
not.
in you brought in larger guys, but they had no chemistry. You couldn't work Kevin Nash against Yokozuna. You couldn't work Scott Hall against Yokozuna, but you could work Kevin Nash versus Scott Hall because they've known each other forever. So they had chemistry. So Bret Hart becomes that conduit. He's now anointed as the person that is going to change this. The problem was the undercard. So let's talk about the WWE and WCW undercard. What would you like to know about that, my nephew?
All right, so first I just wanted to go back just a little bit here with stuff that you mentioned. So you had guys like Yokozuna. Eventually they bring in, I believe it's Lex Luger to be kind of the face of the company because you need somebody to replace Hogan. And eventually they kind of realized this just isn't working out. It isn't going to go anywhere. You have guys like Viscera, Big Daddy V, and none of these guys were really a big name talent that anybody really wanted to see. It was just at a time where it's like, okay, they're big, but their characters and what they are, nobody cares. And that's moving into that 1995 era. But you wanted to talk a little bit about the undercard. So what was going on with the mid-card titles at that point? Like, who were those kind of champions? Because those were the workhorse titles at the time, I believe, especially the Intercontinental title, correct?
Yes, but it became a mess. So you had like Davey Boy in there. Your tag titles were switched between like Bob Holly and the 1-2-3 Kid to other people. Smoking Guns, which the only person who came out of that unscathed was Billy Gunn. You had a plethora of just hodgepodge. They did not know what to do. So it brought in Duke the Dumpster, Jarosi, the Godwins, Hog and Pig. I mean, it was just silly stuff. People forget when Helmsley first came in, when Triple H first came in, he was Hunter Hearst Helmsley. He was the blue blood. He was supposed to be this British man that
royalty.
Lives in New England. Oh yeah, it was silly. I think he actually talked an accent for about like 6 months before they canned that.
He definitely did.
Vince saw so much more in him, which he was right, but I digress. WCW wasn't doing any better. So Eric Bischoff decides to launch Nitro. And while the first Nitro was a success, the few that followed after that for a while were just utter trash. It was just so much garbage that you couldn't digest because it was recycled WWF stuff that we'd already let go. We didn't want the steroids. We didn't want Hogan and Savage. So it was floundering in mediocrity. And it was a very difficult time for a long time in the early to mid 90s to watch wrestling. Now, in WCW, before Hogan and his cronies showed up, you had Rick Rude, Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson. You had workers in WCW. Terry Funk, the Great Muta, the person I covered on my first podcast here with Rocky. You had so much talent, and then they brought in Hogan and the Goofballs, and it was just garbage. Duggan. I mean, Duggan might be a legit tough guy, but in the ring, he's the DS's. He's the drizzling.
You're not wrong. However, was it Mortis and Glacier? When did they end up as part of the company? Because I had heard something about somebody got brought into the company and immediately Glacier and Mortis kind of just looked at each other and it was like, yeah, we're screwed. We're done.
I've got that. So we're going to get there. Okay. So Rick Rude gets injured by Sting and he can't wrestle anymore. He never wrestled another match. He showed up in ECW a couple times, WWE, WCW, then had a heart attack and died. Rick Rude was one of the greatest heat-gathering heels of all time. He was amazing. People ask me if you could pick one heel, and I love Ric Flair, but they're like, if you could pick somebody else to build a company around, it's Rick Rude. Rick Rude was it. Lex Luger was the guy that Rick Rude wished he was. So, did I say that right?
I believe so. Lex Luger wishes he was Rick Rude. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I reverse that. And Lex, if you're listening, sorry, man. You had the body. You did not have the skill in the ring, and you did not have the heat. But you had so many talented people in WCW, and then Hogan's whole crew, Nasty Boys, came in. And while I'll give Nasty Boys something. They can always garner heat. No matter where they go, they're going to grab heat. And they're going to make the crowd hate them. But always putting titles on them, yes, you do it once. Just to have a mega babyface tag team go over them. But they outlived their welcome at some point. So, here we are in the 90s. Now wrestling's floundering. WWF can't figure out what to do because they did the Hogan Bret Hart debacle as far as what we're going to do with the title. So Bret loses to Yokozuna just for Hulk Hogan to get it. No one wants it. Hulk Hogan's out of the company a couple months later. Yokozuna, I love you, baby. You sleep well in heaven because you beat Hulk Hogan, and he is one of the worst in-ring competitors of all time. So Hogan's gone. Now we have to build a company around Hogan and Bret in WWF. While WCW is using these old stars that no one cares about. This is starting to rub the Monday Night Wars. So the kickoff of the Monday Night Wars is Luger jumping back from the US or Lex Express, which was a failed experiment. It's great if you have the look, but if you have, I would say Lex Luger's in-ring is about on par with Hogan. There's nothing that will wow you. It's the same 6 or 7 moves, and that's it. Getting back to brass tacks and baseball bats, my friend. So Luger shows up on the first Nitro when he was booked for a bunch of Raws. WWE didn't know because they forgot that they let his contract lapse. So he's booked for like 5 or 6 shows, and all of a sudden they're turning on TV and they see him coming out of the Mall of America, I think out of a Gap or something like that, which it's not bad clothes, but I'm a more Banana Republic guy, same company, but higher threads. So what it comes down to is that was the first shot. So all of a sudden we start getting a little bit of competition, but it wasn't great still. All you had in WWE was Bret, Owen, Bulldog, Shawn. Diesel, he couldn't work. He was just an attraction. And Razor Ramon, Scott Hall could work, but was he working that day? We don't know. And so then there were some very talented undercard guys. Bob Holly. I was not a fan of him when I was young. You know what I'll say about Bob? Solid worker. 100%. I look back at his matches. The guy never missed a cue, never missed a damn thing. Bob Holly was great. He just wasn't a marquee. That's not his fault. They didn't market him right. They didn't know what to do with him. And he was Southern. So Vince already had it out for him when he got in there. Thing is, Bob could beat the heck out of guys whenever he wanted to because he was a legit tough guy. So Vince kept him on to kind of take care of things when Vince didn't like somebody. Now, getting back to WCW, they're floundering. They're just using old WWF, WWE, whatever you want to call it, main events over and over again. People aren't buying into it. People don't want to see Duggan. Do you know Steve Austin's last match? He lost the U.S. title to Duggan in a 30-second roll-up.
Really?
Absolutely. It was disgusting. And the people, like some clapped, but most of them sat on their hands. They didn't want to see this anymore. So Steve Austin gets injured. He goes away. Mark Marrow decides he wants to go someplace else. Now you guys might know him as Johnny B. Bad, which was his most entertaining point of his career. He was great as Johnny B. Bad. As Mark Marrow as himself. Oh God. Dear Chris.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I remember when I got the WWE Network and I started going back and forth watching between Nitro and Monday Night Raw from back in that era, and I was actually asking you, like, hey, who's this Johnny B. Bad guy? He's actually pretty good. And then you immediately just said, it's Mark Marrow. I still can never forget just thinking, like, it's that guy? How did he make such a drastic flip? I don't get it. And yeah, I guess it leads us to here.
Well, because Vince wanted that character so bad. Then he realized he couldn't own the character because it was owned by WCW. It's one of the things WCW screwed Vince on. And so he didn't know what to do. So like, well, I'll just make him the wild man, Mark Marrow. And before he got injured, he did some amazing stuff. He was supposed to be a main eventer. Their new breed. This was the new breed now version of WWE, WWF, whatever you want to call it. I'm still going to call it WWF at the time. Okay. So their people, Bret and Shawn were made. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall jumped. So they thought the next people who were going to be the main eventers, Triple H, who got punished for the whole curtain call. so he was screwed. So he got put down to the mid card. But their main eventers: Ahmed Johnson, Mark Marrow. Oh, there's somebody else in there that was just like heinous. That you're just like, what were you thinking?
Was it Sid Vicious, or I know he was around in that era.
Sid hopped back and forth. I told you about the time I prank called Sid. That was really funny.
You did?
Oh yeah, that was one of my funniest things I ever did. My friend Tom and I. Okay, guys, we'll sidebar real quick. So Sid lives in West Memphis, Arkansas. I used to live in Memphis. My friend Tom and his now wife, but when they were dating, they broke up for a hot second. And so she was sitting in a bar someplace and Sid started hitting on her. Tom called her because he was like, we need to be together, and Sid gets on the phone and like cuts a promo on him. About 3 or 4 years later, after they're married, Tom calls me. He's like, "Are you at the French Riviera Spa?" Which is a place I used to work out at. Yes, guys, the skinny guy used to work out. I was like, "No." He's like, "I'm across the street from your place. You're not going to believe this, but Sid Vicious is working out with Scott Hall." I was like, "Well, we got to take care of this." So he came over. We called the French Riviera Spa on Union Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. And we asked for his real name, Sid Udy. And he answered the phone, and we cut a promo on him and called him everything but a man. And he started breathing and huffing and puffing like he was going to cut a promo back. And we made fun of him and called him everything but a man. And I kind of feel bad about it, but I don't. He shouldn't have messed with Tom's wife, because Meredith, his wife, is absolutely gorgeous. My girlfriend, Jennifer, and you can attest to this, is absolutely gorgeous. Meredith is absolutely gorgeous, and he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have been trying to get on. Even though they were broken up, I mean, he was married. Don't be a dumbass. Okay, so let's get back. So Sid's coming in and out of both companies. Vader leaves WCW for WWE. He was supposed to be a main eventer. However, he has the Kuwait thing, and then he can't get along with Shawn. Now, Shawn was Vince's favorite to watch shower. So Vince really liked Shawn, and he was getting tired of Brett because Brett would always beat up Shawn, which I think is hilarious. So now we get into this limbo. So the NWO is forming. The biggest thing was Hogan turning heel. People never believed they would see it. When I heard it, God rest his soul, Scott Blair calls me and he says, "Michael, you're not going to believe what happened." I said, "What?" He goes, "I watched, I don't know, Bash at the Beach." He's like, "Hogan turned heel." I was like, "Are you serious?" It's the first time I wanted to see Hogan in 15 years to see if it was actually real. And I was like, "It's an angle. It's not." And he's like, "No, dude." He was also getting, Meltzer's, Observer and stuff like that. So he knew a bit more than me. And this is also the birth of the internet, folks. So this is a revolution in wrestling. So now you have wrestling hotlines that are online. You have all kinds of different wrestling stories and things like that you can buy into online. And so we're all learning stuff. And you weren't even born yet. So
yeah, unfortunately.
This is how it goes. All of a sudden, the guy that they embarrassed bringing into WWF, Steve Austin, as the ringmaster, Ted DiBiase's understudy, gets hurt. And instead of being fired, he comes back as Stone Cold Steve Austin. His own idea. And when he told people he wanted this idea and this way to do it, they thought they would give them names like Chili McFreeze and Ice Dagger.
Baron Von Frost.
Yes.
Because yeah, I read up on this one actually. So he had been watching a documentary about some sort of a cold killer, and he really wanted to work with just the word cold somehow to get into it, and they gave him Baron Von Frost and stuff like that. He eventually was just getting tired of it, and his legend has it, his wife at the time came over because he was sick at the time, or maybe just having a cup of tea or whatever, and she handed him, it was either a hot drink or hot soup, something like that, and she said, "Make sure you finish that before it gets Stone Cold Steve Austin." And he just stopped and looked at her and was like, "That's it. That's the name. We're going with it."
And it's very interesting because I believe that might have still been Jeannie which was Chris Adams' ex-wife, who, yeah, Chris Adams,
Chris Adams, the guy from WCCW. Yeah.
Chris Adams trained Steve Austin. But anyway, we're not going to go there. We can cover that some other time. So Steve Austin starts to get hot. They start to do the angle with Tyson. Now, Bischoff lies through his teeth. He says when they knew that they were working with Mike Tyson, he knew it was done. No. WCW was not done at that point. They were not done. They were hot. They were still red hot, and they were red hot for another year. There's 83 weeks, and it didn't end with that. That was part of it, but it didn't end with that. What killed them is they started doing really stupid storylines, and everybody thought that WCW all of a sudden was like this really serious thing. Now, mind you, folks, you had to go through an era where you had the Dungeon of Doom, which used to mean something in Florida or the NWA in the 80s. But in the 90s, you had the Yeti, which, Yeti, by the way, if you guys don't know, is a Sasquatch that lives in the Arctic, but they made it a mummy. Yeah. And
I still don't understand how they made that. I don't know if I want to call it a mistake or what they were trying to rebrand this creature as. I'm still lost. I don't know what they were thinking.
I really don't think they just knew what to do. They didn't know what to call it. They couldn't call it the Mummy because I think that's probably trademarked by Universal. And they were working in Universal Studios a lot too for their Saturday nights. Don't want to step on those toes. So that's my speculativeness, but I don't know. Now, getting back to it, they only created in WCW at this point for the latter part of the 90s when you were about to be born a few stars. So I'm going to talk about WCW stars and WWE stars that had blossomed at that time. Are you ready?
Absolutely, because I know a couple, but this is something that I've wanted to hear more about.
Okay, so the first thing they wanted to do, and these weren't stars, Eric Bischoff thought in 1996 that video games were going to get big as they are today. So he thought that he would create stars that would be big for their video games, which everybody says their video games sucked back then, by the way. So this is where it gets interesting. He created Mortis and Glacier. First, Glacier. This guy had the talent of a toothpick. He was god-awful terrible. I actually met him once when he was hungover, leaving a show in Ohio. Smelled like a crock pot of booze. And I was like, "Aren't you Glacier?" He like burped, and I was like, "Holy God, you're Glacier." And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Yeah, a friend of mine's a fan of yours. I'm not." And I just walked away, and he was barely able to walk to his car. Now, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I believe it was him. The other one was an incredibly talented human being named Chris Kanyon, and they made him Mortis. The idea was they thought it was going to be like the next version of Mortal Kombat because Mortal Kombat video game was so big at the time. Heck, you know I hate video games, but I played Mortal Kombat in an actual arcade, kids. In an actual arcade. So, the second they saw the NWO come out, Chris Kanyon said that he was sitting with Glacier in their bedroom, and they did all these vignettes for them, by the way. Tons of vignettes, tons. Glacier's coming. Mortis, Glacier's coming. Mortis, Glacier's coming. And they said the second they saw the NWO form, that Kanyon looked at Glacier and said, "We're done. We're screwed. Like our push is over." And they were right. They were right. And they still tried to push it. It didn't work. And actually, at the end of one Nitro, I can't remember what Nitro it was, but this is awesome. At the end of one Nitro, they had like WCW good guys like, DDP and stuff like that, which we'll get to in a second, and Lex Luger and stuff like that. And the NWO in the ring, it's like a big like face-off, right? And then the blood runs cold guys come in, like Glacier, Mortis, Wrath, who turned out to be Brian Clark, Ernest Miller, and they kept zooming in on them like they were going to be something, and that's when people turned the channel to WWE. They're like, these guys are idiots. So that was a failed experiment, obviously, right?
Right.
So that was like this whole storyline they built up for like 6 or 7 months for one guy in Canyon who could wrestle really well, one guy who was good for a big man in Brian Clark, a guy who was absolutely terrible in ring in Glacier, and then Ernest Miller who could gain heat because people wanted to change the channel on him. So that's what we had. That's what we had. So WCW is circling. Now, the people that they actually created. DDP. Even though I believe I saw him in Dallas before he was in WCW, it wasn't the fact that he was there before. And people forget that he was actually the guy driving the car, I think, for the Honky Tonk Man in WrestleMania 3. Did you know that?
I had no idea. This is the first time I'm ever hearing of that.
You might want to look that one up. DDP was a perennial jobber. Just a career put over guys. He started out as a manager. He was goofy. He was out of shape. Not out of shape, okay? Everybody's better looking than I am. But he didn't look like a wrestler. And he was a guy who put people over, and they built him. They actually made him a star. The problem is they didn't know when to stop pushing him until Goldberg came in. That's their second person. Third person is Sting. But Sting wasn't actually created by WCW. He was created by the UWF. He was part of a merger. He came in with Hot Stuff International being managed and ran by Eddie Gilbert. But he was a career WCW guy. Those are the three people. Buff Bagwell was actually the last guy besides Sting to never jump ship. But DDP never jumped ship. He just appeared as the car driver for that WrestleMania 3 instance. He wasn't actually part of anything at that point, so that's why he could do that. So I believe that he's a WCW homegrown star. And of course, Goldberg was Goldberg. So now we have this momentum, but everybody said it's Sting, it's Sting, it's Sting. So now we start the 18-month odyssey of the storyline that had the worst payoff in history. Now, if you turn your channel from back then, WTBS, to USA, we were seeing two different products. And the version of the products you had was because that you had so many super religious people working at WTBS, and there was an underground promotion out of Philadelphia, and they created a buzz. That was called ECW. Now that buzz started actually in 1994. Now I'm going to rewind a little bit because the stars of there were stars of yesteryear like Terry Funk, Don Morocco, Jimmy Snuka, and stars of tomorrow, and maybe some who never got their chance. Sabu, Rob Van Dam. These were people, Taz, that had a future. And people who could make these people who had a future to actually have a past. That's a sexy thing. You had a mad scientist named Paul Heyman in charge of it. And what also happened in the 90s is that there was another last territory that closed up. And that was Jim Cornette's best podcaster in Louisville, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Now, Jim Cornette has always been obsessed with tag team wrestling, so there was a lot of tag team matches. But do you know the stars that came out of Smoky Mountain?
I'll be honest, I actually don't. I know like a couple that have been a part of it, but I don't know who like are the biggest stars out of it, because I know that Johnny K9 was involved with it, but honestly, that's one of the only people that I really know for sure came through it.
Al Snow, Kane, the Rock and Roll Express, but they've wrestled everywhere. I mean, the Rock and Roll Express.
They have been everywhere.
Yes. Chris Candido, Balls Mahoney, but he was known as Abu Singh, and Boo Bradley. Shoot, man. They almost everybody who came into the second half of VCW came out of Smoky. The Gangstas. They were pulling their gangsta shtick I watched my language there. They were pulling their gangsta shtick in Knoxville in the most racist crowd. And New Jack has been on interviews saying, I loved it. I had a pistol packing.
That does add up for him.
There's a lot of people who came out of Smoky Mountain. Tracy Smothers, Dirty White Boy, but a lot of people who were being used in the 90s from Smoky Mountain, which was also in a working relationship with WWE, were getting renamed and given stupid gimmicks. So if you ever watched Tony Anthony, the Dirty White Boy, have a match, he was like Tommy Dreamer and Raven. He was amazing. He was just the Dirty White Boy. And when people ask what's that mean, the Dirty White Boy, it's because it's a Tennessee thing. You just look it up, guys. I'm not going to explain it to you. But he was like, a lot of people said Tommy Dreamer versus Tony Anthony, the Dirty White Boy, would be an awesome match. Just anything goes. There were so many people who then migrated to ECW after Smoky Mountain closed. But they were used so bad. I mean, look at Chris Candido becoming Skip and Sunny being, well, she turned out to be a whore, let's be honest. But she was. Everybody knows it. They've reported it, and she's in prison. And rightfully so. You killed a person. But there was a lot of talent that Jim Cornette could see and that Paul Heyman could see. So that was the Underground Buzz. Smoky Mountain closes. Lance Storm, Chris Jericho, they were in Smoky Mountain before they were in ECW. A lot of these people were ported over. It was the only indie to work, and Vince, they're not 6 foot and 300 pounds. WCW didn't know who they were. So, there was a lot of work to be put in. So this is how the 90s started getting turned on its ear. Because now, all the goofiness of only having a few top stars of WWF and WCW having way too many top stars, or thinking they did, and nobody wanting to put over anybody, it was a cluster. And nobody knew how to book anything. So that's when they said, okay, we're going to start the Attitude Era. And that's when they started getting more violent, taking things more serious, dropping the gimmicks, getting rid of all the work stuff. And that's how WWF eventually beat and destroyed WCW in the 90s.
Right. I mean, for a long time, they had the occupational gimmicks going on that, honestly, nobody was really wanting to watch any of that. Like, how am I supposed to relate to, a plumber as a wrestler or anything like that? Shawn Michaels at the time, he actually was it seemed like just him, and that worked wonders enough. Bret Hart, best there is, best there was, best there would ever be, because what occupation is that? He's a wrestler. That's who we wanted to see. We didn't care about, these people being garbage men or whatever, because, okay, cool, you're representing every occupation, but nobody asked for that. Nobody cared about that. The New Generation era, it kind of had its flaws for sure at the time.
The New Generation era, which was right before the Attitude Era, was such a terrible idea. I remember, like I said, God rest his soul, Scott Blair calling me one day. He's like, well, on commentary, we got a new representative of the new generation. It's the Honky Tonk Man. I mean, and that's when the Honky Tonk Man brought out Billy Gunn as Rockabilly. It was the same stuff recycled. We used to call it recycled Alpo. You can figure out what that is. So just one of those deals where it was just, yeah, I think it's set in. It's just one of those deals where Road Dogg was the roadie, and they were also using and borrowing a lot of people from Memphis. But anybody they borrowed or used from Memphis, they would usually mistreat. Of course, a lot of people from Memphis, let's be honest, were unruly and they weren't very tamed, and I know this for a fact. A lot of them just did not have manners because they were used to being big fish in a small pond, and now they're in a really big pond and small fish, and they didn't know how to deal with it. But the Smoky Mountain thing, I mean, you bring in Chris Candido. I mean, the guy was talented, so talented. Hell, oh my gosh. And Tom Pritchard. and we don't know what to do with. Let's just make them a goofy bodybuilding team, and then let's make because Shawn Michaels is such a douchebag because he was getting with Sonny that they buried Chris Candido. I guarantee you this much: if you put Chris Candido in a room with Shawn Michaels and told him what was really going on, Shawn would probably be crying on the floor when he was done because his friends couldn't come in and save his life. And that's what happened. Like, the 90s were a crazy place. So as we go to close the 90s, Smoky Mountain's gone, ECW's going to close up, WCW's going to close up in a couple of years, and all of a sudden we find ourselves saying, was there really a war? Well, you had to evolve. WCW could not evolve at that time. And they started going back to childish stuff. So they were the ones to start with the more adult things with the NWO. I mean, Bischoff's only idea ever, which he ripped off from Japan, the Aristus group, and he had no follow-up. And then he gave everybody so much political power within their contracts that the place was imploding left and right. And then you had moments like the finger poke of doom. You had moments like Ernest the Cat Miller beating the Great Muta, because that's injustice. You had so much garbage going on. Then you hired people who couldn't be muzzled, like Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara, and then Ed Ferrara doing just the worst ever portrayal of JR.
Yeah, the Oklahoma gimmick, which is very looked down upon in the wrestling world now, just making fun of even like the health aspects of Jim Ross. Why would you do that? That is a terrible idea. But another thing that I've actually read up on a little bit was WCW had some of the worst financial issues possible. Like, they would fly the entire roster to every single show for the entire time that WCW was around. Can you imagine just bringing every single person, even the ones that aren't going to be used in the show? They didn't care. They were bringing everybody.
They were making such poor. They were making such poor decisions that I believe they had Lanny Poffo. Now, don't quote me on this, but I think I read it in Sex Lies and Headlocks. He was on the roster for 2 years for like $150,000 a year and never set foot in an arena.
Jeez.
Just because he was Randy Savage's brother. There's a lot of people like that. A lot of people will tell you, like, hey, like Iron Sheik, I think he was making $100,000 and they just forgot to deny his contract, so it just rolled over and they just kept paying him.
Amazing.
They made so many piss poor decisions as a company. I like, honestly, if I had that kind of money, I could only imagine if Paul Heyman had that money with DCW, what he could have done. He could have kept his talent, not given him away, and had a national product. True. Or even Jim Cornette with Smoky Mountain, because Smoky Mountain, if you watch some of those matches, those are great matches. They were entertaining matches, and there were storylines. Everything was built around a real story. And so that's what all of a sudden dried up. It became ECW got really mimicked because that's what people wanted to see. People were staying up. Your Uncle Tim and I would stay up till 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. Boy, we really had a life. Girls really wanted to get to know me, guys. And just so we could watch our 40 minutes of ECW on Sports Channel USA. I've talked about it just. It was the first time I saw it. I was living out the 166 house. So, guys, I used to live at this house at the corner of 166 and Route 534. You don't need to know where. And we'd gotten cable, and I was 19. It was maybe 20. I was 20. And this was like 96, okay? And I'm flipping through the channels. We had about 40 channels, guys. That was the luxury back then. And I found ECW on Sports Channel America at 2 a.m. And I was like, oh my God. The first thing I did, I called my friend, the late great Scott. I said, Scott, turn on channel 20 right now. He's like, why? I said, just do it. And he saw it. He's like, oh my God. And so every week. We would talk on the phone while we watched it until it eventually Sports Channel went away. And but that's how we got introduced to Stevie Richards, Raven. Well, I knew Raven when he was Scotty the Body, or even before that, like Scott Anthony. I mean, I've watched him since like '91, but
Johnny Polo and Scotty Flamingo, I believe his other names were.
all those, yeah, definitely. I knew the whole gambit. I mean, I'm obviously, we know I'm a huge Raven fan. We should find out how big of a Raven fan I am. But that's first time I saw Eddie Guerrero. First time I'd seen Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko. First time I'd seen Rey Mysterio, Psychosis. I mean, all this was brand new. And I'm seeing stuff that I'm like, okay, Hogan's doing a leg drop, and I'm watching Psychosis do like a 450 splash, and I'm going, what am I watching? And then, like, you know, the Sandman coming out with a cigarette and just caning the living hell out of somebody. And Tommy Dreamer almost dying every night. And Raven cutting some of the best promos you've ever seen in your life. And Terry Funk coming out and almost dying also. Wrapping himself in barbed wire. And going against Sabu, who... it was just different. So that underground feeling and how that gave birth to the Attitude Era and how that became what was the new breed of wrestling was very important, because we needed that. If we didn't have that shot in the arm, that kick in the ass, that new breath in our throats, wrestling, I wouldn't say it would have went under, because USA had a long-term contract with WWE, but I don't know if we'd all be fans now. It might be under now, because WCW wasn't going to last. That was the 90s, guys.
That's very true. I mean, after the 90s, well, even during the 90s, you also had smaller companies, of course. You had the indies. You had, I want to call them almost clones of ECW, kind of like XPW and stuff, that existed, but just it didn't have the same feel or anything for when it existed back then. And I guess it's reemerged now, but I'm not really sure how well they're doing, which I don't expect them to do that great, honestly, from how they were before. And, you know.
Well, I mean, if Rob Black still owns it, go to hell, Rob Black. I'll tell you that right now. I mean, any guy who ran his company off of being a porno company and then asking like some of the people to star in pornography is... that's all I got to say about that.
That's beyond words, honestly.
Now, if I'm wrong, Rob Black, if I'm wrong, it's at 144Captain on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. But everybody I know has told me that. And, you know, you had CZW, Combat Zone Wrestling. Combat Zone Wrestling actually infiltrated ECW. I think it was CZW, but I'm not positive. Infiltrated ECW for a pay-per-view, and a bunch of ECW guys came out and beat up the wrestlers who were in the front row. And I think one of them was John Moxley that got knocked around.
Interesting.
Yeah, you can look that one up. I'm not positive it was him. Guys, look, I'm almost 50. So my memory isn't quite what it used to be, but it's pretty damn sharp for being a wrestling historian. So, with that being said, the 90s were a very interesting time. We started out with garbage. We started out with steroids. We started out with larger-than-life characters. We became sharpshooting wrestlers. Then we became great wrestling. Then we became hardcore wrestling. Then we became very serious storylines. Then we became making characters that people wanted to see and people wanted to invest in. The Undertaker was no longer dead. He was a biker. It made sense because people are about to flush the toilet on it. And everybody says they hate that version of The Undertaker. That's my favorite version. And he'll tell you it's one of his favorite versions because he could actually sell and show people he could work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, I feel like, how do I put this? The biker version is probably much closer than the Dead Man was to The Undertaker, like personality-wise. I feel like that's a little bit closer to him, you know, being, you know, a biker and just being a wrestler at that point. That's kind of how it was seen. Once again, not really occupational anymore, but just something that somebody like him probably might enjoy or something, you know?
Absolutely. It's you're amplifying who you are in real life. And I think he enjoyed that. Now, I'm going to turn this up another notch. wrestlers who came about in the 90s that had longevity. Are you ready?
Absolutely, because I can name a few, obviously being Undertaker, Kane, Mick Foley, The Rock, Stone Cold. Rikishi's kind of around, but I'm not really sure if I'd want to count him in that category. Can always go with, I mean, Big Daddy V was around, but do we really want to count him as part of that? I'm going to say no. Sting
What is your
definitely
love
stuck
with that guy? Do you remember the day you texted me and you're like, he died? I was like, yeah, I'm talking to his wife right now.
So I'm just saying that because in the book that you recommended to me, Titan Sinking, it kind of mentions him as one of the people that Vince tried to push as one of the big men, but it just didn't really work. It wasn't filling the void of Hogan, Andre, all these larger than life characters. So that's kind of why my mind keeps kind of flushing back to it. But yeah, so obviously you have guys like Sting. I don't think DDP really lasted too long into the 2000s or anything like that, but I've noticed that Sting going into TNA and such after WWE kind of bought out WCW and everything, it's different. He really kept the character together, and honestly, he's been loved wherever he's gone. So I gotta say, Sting, hats off to you, man. You've had a long career, just retired. Congratulations on that, man. But those are a few that I can name that I know lasted from there.
So you have a lot of names that I'm gonna overlap with you. Kane, these are people that like kind of popped onto the scene in the 90s, as opposed to they might have been working before that. But Kane, Al Snow, um, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm. Oh shoot, man! I mean, there's so many.
Eddie.
Yeah, some names I can't say. The another name I want to say, but I can't. Dean Malenko. Um, I mean, it was a dawn. Shane Douglas, Raven, Perry Saturn. A lot of these people became household names from the 90s that no one ever gives the credit for. Brian Pillman. And ladies and gentlemen, every time if you are in Florida and you see Lexus King wrestle, just scream Brian Pillman. Just scream Brian Pillman, because his father was amazing, and his father reinvented a character that was so amazing that Steve Austin even said, "This is going to rival me." Goldberg. I mean, Chavo Guerrero. There were so many names that came out in the 90s that people will not give. I mean, honestly, Jeff Jarrett was wrestling in USWA, but no one was seeing it unless you were watching ESPN. So Jarrett got bigger then. China, not a big China fan, but yeah, China.
Yeah, she was still around. The Hardys, Christian and Edge, they were around in the 90s as well.
How about some kid named Helmsley or some kid named The Rock? Austin was around before that, but 89, 88, 89 was like really his start in Dallas. But I mean, 90s is when he really got into WCW and really blew up. There are so many names that came out of the 90s. Like the 80s had a lot of names, but the territories were so big, and there were so many older people that were retiring. It wasn't the same. The 90s made more wrestling and more wrestling fans than any other generation. And then your Uncle Tim, he and I would get magazines. Yeah, because every girl wanted to get to know me back then. And we'd find out about like Kenta Kobayashi and Shinya Hashimoto and everybody overseas. Super Delphine.
Didn't he have a tag team partner? Super Delphine. Didn't he have like a tag team partner that was like themed after a crab or something?
Oh, I can't remember his name. Oh, you put me on the spot on that one. But yeah. It was just a different time. And it was romantic with wrestling back then because it became hot, and that was the dawn of the tape trading era. And so like RF video got really hot, and it was before DVD or the birth of DVD at the end of it, like 90 '98, something like that, is when DVDs started to blow up. But before that, RF video, everybody, you just get on the internet, the birth and the baby of the internet, and you'd be like, you have this match of this, well, I'll trade you this match of that. So you've got Hogan versus Muta when he actually worked, versus, having Super Delphine and Grand Sasuke versus, Rey Mysterio and Psychosis. I mean, the stuff that we had to tape trade back then, and the abilities and the hunger for it. The hunger was at its epitome. 1990s.
It's a good way to put it. I mean, so growing up, I was obviously a little bit after the tape trading era, but I remember my friends and I, we had the DVD box sets of certain wrestlers and their matches, because for a while WWE was releasing like, oh yeah, here's the history of DX, here's the history of, Jeff Hardy's career. They called it My Life, My Rules. Okay, here's it didn't matter who it was really, if they were going to be leaving the company, or if WWE just felt like, hey, this guy, he's gotten big enough, we could probably make some money off of if we were to release just a set of his matches. That's what me and my friends used to do, in a way, because we used to either go to each other's houses, just watch together, or we would just trade for a week and then trade back after. So, yeah, I kind of hear you on that. I mean, it definitely kind of lasted as well.
Well, before streaming took over, I remember in 2004, my best friend Miguel, he got me the Fallen Ones DVD.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I threw it out after the whole incident, but I had Benoit's DVD, and just watching his whole story and everything else, it was just amazing. And so I just look at, like, it was really big. And like the last wrestling DVD I bought was Ladies and Gentlemen, My Name is Paul Heyman.
Interesting.
Yes, that was the last one I ever bought. And then, of course, it's the network and everything else after that. The network was first rumored in like 97, 98, the 90s.
So I don't know about that necessarily, but I do remember that. So I had a few DVDs that were called just Legends of Wrestling, and it went over a few different guys' careers, Junkyard Dog, Sergeant Slaughter, Ric Flair, I believe, and just those guys' names. And it had a little commentary table where all these guys like Mike Hayes and Jim Ross just were talking about them. Now, I remember one of the previews before it actually got to the menu and everything, which not sure why they included, previews, but I guess you got to give commercials somehow when it's not fully on cable. But something that I really remember distinctly was they were trying to push WWE On Demand, which was going to be like a cable channel that you could watch any, event that has ever happened or anything like that.
Yes. That was the original idea for the network. And if you listen to old Bruce Pritchard podcasts, he'll tell you, like Vince wanted a physical network. So the 90s were a very strange era. Like they always parody, like, oh, well, Shawn Michaels is on AOL.com. That used to be a big thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist at all. It is funny how much technology and everything else. WCW actually did a streaming listen per view on the internet. There was no camera. It was just, you had to listen to it for $5. Just a different time, man.
Interesting. That's not how I would want to spend my money. I can see why that didn't work out.
People did it.
Jeez.
People did it. Yeah. So why don't we wrap this up? The 90s are over. We're in the 2020s. I'm almost 50. You were a little baby.
Now I'm 25.
Yeah, you almost... The man teat.
Oh, man. But, all right, so while wrapping it up, guys, I will recommend, if you guys want to know more about this kind of stuff, definitely read the Titan trilogy. So Titan Sinking, Titan Shattered, Titan Screwed. These books really have a good insight on everything that was going on backstage, and there's some things that are pretty gritty in here, especially about guys like Randy Savage and stuff. So if you want to learn more about this kind of stuff, either talk to us or start reading the book. Either way, you can learn a lot. Michael, you have any recommendations for everybody?
Absolutely. Like I always say, Death of the Territories is a great book, and Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, great book too. Of course, I mean, like, big fan of Ric Flair's book, but I'm a big fan of Ric Flair. Sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit. But aside from that, the one book I can't find is there obviously not an autobiography, but a biography on Andre the Giant. I want to read more about him because everybody has stories about him. But also, Bruce Brody's book is probably one of the best books I've ever read in my life, and it's made very, very digestible. So when you read it, it's done by quotes of people instead of reading in the format of paragraphs. It's very cool. So I highly recommend that one. Aside from that, if you want to reach me, it's at 144captain on X. And how about you?
You guys can always reach me at Maintenance Mav. We can talk about wrestling. We can talk about whatever. I don't really care. Just hit up my DMs. I really don't care. We can talk about whatever from wrestling. If you have any episode suggestions as well, guys, go ahead and hit up either of us. We'd be happy to potentially give a response or maybe just do it on the show and give you a shout out after. Speaking of which, Michael, do you have any shout outs for anybody? I don't have anybody for this episode.
There's always one shout out. You know who it is.
Potential future aunt.
I love you, Jennifer. I love you with my whole heart. So, it's just, look, guys, I don't care if you want to hear it or not. I love her. And if you saw her, you'd love her too.
All right, guys, as always, do something nice for somebody. You never know who needs it. And with that, in the words of Memphis Mark, I'm out.
Thanks for listening to the WWE Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a show, or head to WWEpodcast.com. And for all of these shows ad-free, head over to patreon.com/WWE Podcast. Until then, we'll see you next time.